Welcome everyone. This is my second video blog for 2017, and this video blog is going to be posted on my www.natgas.info website as well as on my YouTube channel. And please do leave some comments if you feel like there's something you would like me to talk about or you don't agree with some of what I say. So it has been a few months. I did the last blog, I think, earlier part of 2017, and it has been an interesting last few months. There's been some good developments, some probably not so good developments. Before we jump into the markets, I just want to talk about something that's quite exciting for me. My second edition of my book just came out, Fundamentals of Natural Gas, an International Perspective. So this is a completely revised, or I think 70% revised edition of the book that I first wrote in 2006. And I do think you should look at getting this book if you're interested in learning kind of from a very simple layman's language exactly what is natural gas, especially around the world, what is LNG, what are LNG markets, LNG pricing, contracts, etc. A very simple, easy read. You can get it on Amazon, also from the publisher Penwell. If you go to www.natgas.info, you can actually see the links to this book to buy the book. And again, comments on the book will be appreciated. Okay, so let's talk about the markets. You know, there has been a little bit of news. Some things there seems to be a growing positive sentiment in the marketplace, which of course is great for everybody. We need that. But unfortunately, prices really haven't recovered. I mean, I think this morning the price in Japan was still less than $6, the spot market. Now, of course, I would always say the spot market does not reflect the true price of LNG. We're talking about LNG in this blog more than anything. But, you know, the spot market does change the sentiment. So the fact that spot market prices haven't recovered as fast as people had hoped they will is a cause of a little bit of a concern, and I hope that does change. But unfortunately, spot prices in Asia, which tends to be what everybody talks about, are related to oil prices. And oil price, as you know, is a completely different animal. Nothing to do with really true supply-demand characteristics. It's more of a political thing. But in the end of the day, oil prices are soft. I don't have a view on how oil prices are going to do. I think no one really does. It's really a function of OPEC and other things. But the point is that if oil prices are low, spot prices tend to be low for LNG, and that changes sentiment, even though I don't think that is reflecting on reality. So let's talk a little bit about what I see the reality, and then please leave comments and we can have a bit of a discussion on this. So let's jump in and talk about demand. Now, demand is actually much more robust than I think the consultants and some of the media seems to indicate. You know, we are definitely seeing demand growing everywhere, in my view, especially in the emerging markets. I was just thinking, you know, I don't think there's a single country in Asia that is not landlocked, that is not either importing LNG today or wants to import LNG in the near future. That is pretty crazy. And I'm talking about including countries that were big exporters like Indonesia and Malaysia. And okay, maybe Brunei is an exception, but Indonesia and Malaysia were both LNG exporters and now are also LNG importers. And we are going to see every country. We're talking about Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Vietnam, Philippines. The list goes on and on. There's not a single country in Asia that is not thinking of importing LNG that has a coastline. So that just tells you that there is a huge future demand, because what has really happened that I don't think people have noticed in the last 5 years, as oil prices have been soft, there hasn't been a lot of exploration going on in the world. You know, it used to be the American oil companies were the great explorers of the world and running around everywhere. Well, you know, an American oil and gas company is much better off going back to America and drilling there, where the exploration risk is very low, political risk is low, and the time to commercialize the gas or oil is very, very quick. So we're in a situation where the Americans have pretty much left, the independent Americans especially. You're talking the Murphys, the Anadarkos, the Apaches, the Devons, you know, all those guys, even in the old days, you know, who make the Conocos. These are the guys that made the big discoveries around the world, the frontier exploration. Well, they're pretty much gone. You know, we see a few wells drilled here and there by people like Exxon, and that's great. But I don't think we see the numbers that we should see. And I think that, you know, we had expected 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that the national oil companies will pick up the slack. Well, that hasn't happened. national oil companies, I think, collectively are not a very good group of explorers. They don't take a lot of risk. If they get a dry well, the guy usually gets fired, you know, because a national oil company, so you're wasting a lot of the government's money. There's always an overhang of corruption, real or unreal. And national oil companies really are not in the business to spend $100 million on a well that may fail, because then the politicians will get upset. So, you know, we are not doing enough. The governments around the world are not doing enough to continue to attract the big international oil companies. And they're the ones that, big and small, sorry, that go out and do the exploration. Because without exploration, well, if you don't drill exploration wells today, 5-10 years from now, you're not going to have any gas to export. So this is the problem I see in places like Indonesia, where I see the demand growing massively. We have the Indonesian government announcing 35 gigawatts of power. Most of that will have to come from gas, because it's not like they can build coal-fired power stations to the scale and speed they require without the infrastructure. And there's land is very precious in Indonesia. There's not a lot of it. There's lots of people in Java and other places. So we're not going to see a lot of very fast construction of coal-fired power stations. So 35 gigawatts of power, most of that is going to come from gas. Well, where is that gas going to come from? So that's part of the demand that I see in emerging Asia that I don't think the consultants and the banks of the world give enough credit for. These guys are all building receiving terminals, or going to build receiving terminals. And yes, they are price conscious today, but once you build a receiving terminal, you don't have much of a choice. And you build a power station next to it, what are you going to do? You're going to have to import LNG, and you're going to buy LNG at whatever price it is. Right now, everybody's fat and happy. That's a good word, fat and happy. Why are they fat and happy? Because there's a lot of gas, a lot of LNG, and prices are low. So everybody's thinking this is it. This is a new world. Well, it's not the new world, because we are seeing all of the countries, especially in Asia, but now many other parts of the world, Africa, South America to a limited extent, who are all saying LNG is the fuel we need, because we did not do a good job attracting exploration wells in our own country. So where is the gas going to come from? It's going to come from here. Then we have domestic declining production. Indonesia, domestic declining production. Malaysia, definitely in Europe. I mean, we have political problems in Europe where Groningen and all these other wells, the fields are now dramatically declining at a faster rate than I think people even expected. So there's not a lot of countries in the world where domestic gas production is still rising. But nearly every country in the world, domestic gas demand is increasing. So it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that to make up that shortfall, you're going to have to import LNG, because pipelines don't get built that easily. And so I think that we are being very complacent to think that the days of the surplus will last forever, because, as I think I've tried to demonstrate, we are seeing growing demand. Now, one country we should not ignore at all is China. I think China announced this week that its 14th LNG import terminal is now in operation. Now you compare that to Japan's 35 terminals or Korea's 6 terminals. You know, it's a pretty significant number. But what we don't see is that these new terminals are also being built by private and now provincial companies. It's not just the big 3 Chinese national companies that are building the terminals. It is these private and these very large provincial energy companies. These guys are building terminals because they realize that they now, they can import their own LNG, and because they need to get the gas, and gas is what they need to depend on, because obviously there's environmental issues with building new coal fire, and the people in China are now rich enough they don't need to sit in polluted air anymore. So we are going to see China demand absolutely skyrocket, and I think very, very few people really understand China. I don't think the major consultancy of the world have a clue about how much demand there could be in China. And I think China will overtake Japan in the next few years. And China is only going to go up, and they are going to take the gas no matter what it is. And I think they're gearing up for it. So watch out. China is the story of the future. So let's talk about Korea. Korea is the world's second largest importer of LNG. The KOGAS is the world's single largest LNG importing company. But there's elections coming up, I think next week, or very, very soon. And these elections are quite interesting because both of the front-leaning candidates want to reverse the idea of going back to nuclear or coal. They now want to go back to something other than nuclear and coal. And what is that? That is going to be LNG. So yes, Korean energy demand may not rise, but I see Korean LNG coming back to taking a bigger market share than people had anticipated. Korea puts out these 5-year electrical plans. Well, the last one was pretty negative on LNG. I don't think the next one will be, if any of these two candidates get what they want, which is to basically get rid of the very unpopular nuclear. Can't build coal-fired power stations in Korea very easily, so you're back to building a lot of LNG. And I think Korea will open up an LNG import by private companies as well. So that's Korea. Japan, you know, it's still growing. I mean, the LNG demand year on year was up this year, so far this year. You know, there's a big, always been uncertainty. Since Fukushima, we don't know about Japan's nuclear power station uncertainty. That's going to be something that we hear about all the time. But I am convinced that Japan will still continue to grow slowly on LNG. But it's the rest of the countries. I'm talking about, you know, apart from even Korea that we talked about, is China and India. You know, these LNG terminals in India are running at, you know, over 100% capacity, as some of them are. And there are so many proposals to build these LNG terminals, new terminals in India. And I know that most of them will not get built. But on the other hand, many of them will get built because Indian customers are sick of not having electricity when they need it. And they're sick of not having clean air as well. So I think we're going to see India, CNG for transportation going to grow, power gen is going to come back out. And yes, India has been, you know, very much a price sensitive market. And, you know, right now the gas is barely good enough to price is barely low enough for their power stations. But you got to realize, as the Indian customer gets more richer, he's willing to pay more for reliable electricity. And when he can pay more for reliable electricity, he'll pay more for reliable LNG. And I think India is going to be another people to watch out. So in a nutshell, it's that demand that we are not counting enough. And on the other hand, supply is looking really, really rough. I live in Australia. It is an absolute disaster out here. These 3 coal seam methane power plants in Queensland should never have been built. At least not the scale that they were built. They were built without proven reserves. They were built without government actually checking how much reserves there were. They were built on false promises that they will use their own new gas, not suck in from the domestic gas supply. Well, Australia is suffering from everywhere else. There's not a lot of exploration drilling going on, declining domestic production, and now we have this massive LNG plant sucking in the domestic gas. So there's a massive, massive political backlash against continuing LNG imports. And there's a lot of talk about stopping the LNG imports and going back to, you know, caring about Australian energy resources first. I mean, you know, if you're a manufacturer in Eastern Australia, you cannot even get a gas supply contract. You know, forget about paying 5 times what you used to pay 3 years ago. You can't even get one because everybody's reserving the gas to go to the LNG plants. So what's going to happen is the government's going to step in because the people are pissed off, and they're going to shut down some of these plants, or they're going to combine some of the plants or mothball them, or something's going to happen, and we're not going to see the production that we expected. You know, all these consultants always talk about supply demand forecast and their surplus. Well, their surplus, they base the volume, they base on capacity, not actual production. And I see that Australian LNG production, not the capacity, of course, the production is going to be a lot lower because politically people are not going to allow that much gas to get exported, and feed gas is so expensive here now anyway. So why would you export when you can sell it to the domestic market at a better price than you can sell LNG in Japan, which is what we're thinking about right now. If gas price in Australia is roughly, you know, $10, $12, $15 is what manufacturers are saying in the paper. That's double what they're paying in Japan. So why are you taking this gas, going through the expense of very, very expensive, overpriced LNG facilities, and then exporting it when you can make more money here? So logical, and the people are upset. So I think Australia is not going to produce the gas that everybody expected. So that's a major supply uncertainty. You know, what happened to Ichthys? Delayed once again. Where's Prelude? That ship should have left the shipyard a year, 2 years ago. Obviously, it's not doing well. So these projects, the ones in Western Australia, are getting to be quite expensive. They are not running as smoothly as they will. And I think that some of the people, they're going to be delayed much more. Of course, I think these big companies like Shell are going to continue producing out of these once they get online. Shell, Chevron, Impex. But, you know, they're not going to make a lot of money. And any excuse to shut them down, I think there's be some talk about that. Canada, nothing's happening. I don't see anything changing in Canada for a long time. If any of you guys out there are looking at Canadian gas for your operations, LNG, It's not going to happen unless maybe a small project in BC or something. But none of the big scale projects are going to happen. So that's not going to happen. East Africa, you know, Anadarko is floundering. Mozambique is not going anywhere. I think Exxon's coming in now into one of the blocks. Signifies they're going to do a different type of project, maybe a smaller project, the Coral size project. So East Africa is going to be a lot smaller than people expected. You know, we're not going to see the 30 million ton project coming out of Mozambique anytime soon. Especially after they've spent $1 billion so far and not really got anything to show for it, in my view. So Russia, kind of a wait and see. Yamal looks interesting, looks like it's moving ahead, but I don't think anybody's going to jump in and put a lot of money in Russia right now with the political climate. So I think Yamal will go ahead, surprise to everyone, including myself, but hey, that's great. So if you're an LNG importer, really the world is, and you're looking for new gas, I mean, Qatar does release a moratorium, but you know, that moratorium is released more for domestic supply, and any more gas coming out of Qatar in the near term is going to go down that Dolphin pipe, because the Dolphin pipe has 1 BCF a day extra capacity. So any new capacity will go to Dolphin. That's it. So I don't expect new LNG coming out of Qatar beyond the 77 million tons for at least another decade. So if you're an LNG importer waiting on these projects, I think it's a long wait. The only shining hope is really the US. Now, of course, I work for Texas LNG, and Texas LNG is one of the great projects out there. But in the end of the day, the important message is that incremental LNG to supply this growing demand that I talked about is only going to come from the US. There's really no other place for it. And in fact, we are overestimating how much gas will come out of places like Australia. So next few months, maybe more of the same. Price is going to be soft. But hey, Mr. Customer, don't get complacent. It's going to get ugly. It's going to get ugly really fast. If you're smart, you'll be signing up long-term deals from American producers. Not only Texas LNG, but other guys as well. Because when the tide turns, it turns very quickly. And there's going to be not a lot of gas. And if the customers don't start supporting American projects, there won't be a lot of American projects either. And then we'll all be in big trouble. So that's all I have to say right now. We'll see you in a couple months. Do buy the book, Fundamentals of Natural Gas, An International Perspective. Go to www.natgas.info to read more about it. Thanks. Bye.